The colors of the Chessie and Seaboard System railroads can no longer be seen in daily service. CSX is the well-known contemporary super system that absorbed these two railroads, and they are featured in our presentation. The Chessie and Seaboard were rolled into the CSX transportation system beginning in 1980. We'll also see the intermediate and brief 1972 marketing efforts of the family lines in gray with colorful accents. This was within the Seaboard Group. Mergers have erased the identities of the Chessie System and the Seaboard Coastline Railroads. The super systems we have today have reduced the number of earlier road names to a more effective handful. Looking back into even earlier times, we will also see the first common carrier railroad in the U.S. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and the other predecessors such as the Louisville and Nashville, Seaboard Coastline, the Western Maryland, and the Chesapeake and Ohio. The popular Chessie System was incorporated on February 26, 1973. It was a holding company that consisted of the historic Chesapeake and Ohio and Baltimore and Ohio railroads, and the Western Maryland Railway. On paper, Chessie only lasted until 1980, with the next step in the CSX merger. The Chessie's colors as seen here lasted for much longer than those intervening 7 years. These scenes are at Brunswick, Maryland on the old Baltimore and Ohio main line. The orange lines are the principal B&O tracks. The yellow lines represent the Chesapeake and Ohio, or C&O for short. The wealthy Appalachian coal hauling C&O gained effective control of the B&O by 1962. This was approved at the time by the Interstate Commerce Commission. By 1967, the Western Maryland Railway was included in this grouping of roads. This is Brunswick, Maryland. It was part of the old B&O main line that is now part of CSX. Behind the GP9 is the gray Brunswick station that is now painted red and used as part of the MARC transit system. On this 1956 built GP9, you can see the large black letter C that represents the silhouette of a kitten sleeping on its pillow. It was an advertising symbol for their comfortable passenger train sleeping cars, introduced in 1933 by the Chesapeake and Ohio. Later, the Chessie System was popular with the public were bringing the symbol back, even though there was no remaining passenger service on the Chessie System. That ended in 1971. About 6 miles west of Brunswick is Harper's Ferry, where the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers come together. This station is served today by Amtrak and MARC commuter trains. From here, the old B&O main line follows the Shenandoah River after crossing the Potomac River. This historically important area is filled with national park sites worth investigating. Next is a pair of B30-7 GE units that were built in 1978. They are in Chessie colors, but with the C&O cab marks under the cab window. The Chessie System holding company maintained the separation between the B&O, C&O, and the Western Maryland equipment when painted into the new Chessie colors. The lettering was applied to cabooses as well. We'll see the Seaboard Coastline merger of the 1960s and the Family Line colors of the 1970s. The Seaboard Coastline was a large system that sprawled over the southeast from the tip of Florida up to Richmond, Virginia. We have many nostalgic views of that bygone era. And we'll see power from the Louisville and Nashville Railroad with its tracks shown in yellow that would eventually merge into the Seaboard system, giving more connections to New Orleans and up to Chicago, the rail hub of the U.S. The Seaboard Coastline, in its black with yellow stripes and aluminum-colored lettering, would change into the Family Line's colors of gray with accents of yellow and red, seemingly borrowed from the L&N. All of these steps led up to the forming of the CSX system we know of today, beginning with this early CSX train. We'll see the RF&P that linked the North and South long before it too became part of the CSX in 1991. The F units in this train were former Clinchfield diesels saved by CSX for business trains and specials. The mid-1980s brought the demise of the caboose with new work rule agreements, but this video will surely bring those colorful cabooses back to the screen. Norfolk and Southern had their plans of expansion too. The Norfolk and Southern and CSX eventually divided up the huge Conrail system into two pieces that ended a nearly 40-year unsettling contest for merger and expansion that resulted in the rail scene we see today. For other railroads to run on their tracks, the RF&P required at least the lead locomotive to have a special box that put the signals inside the locomotive's cab. Today's railroading back east has but two massive systems that are vastly more efficient and modern. The numerous roads of earlier times were more individualized and interesting, and through the persistent efforts of Railfans and their movie film cameras long before video cameras came along, we can still enjoy these scenes today. This chart shows the major paths to forming of the CSX system. First is the 1962 C&O merger of the B&O. The WM, or Western Maryland, was controlled by the B&O and brought in a few years later in 1967. These were formed into the Chessie system by 1973. The Chesapeake and Ohio appears on the scene by 1869, a relative newcomer. It was built to connect the city of Richmond, Virginia, to the banks of the Ohio River. The C&O was involved with C.P. Huntington, who was one of the Big Four that built the Central Pacific over Donner Pass out in California. The Ohio River was reached by 1873 near Huntington, West Virginia, named for C.P. Huntington. After an initial stumble, the C&O performed well over the years and even did well in the Great Depression. By 1947, the C&O was wealthy enough to be the New York Central's largest stockholder. The C&O was always looking for merger partners. This potential merger was spoiled by the Chesapeake and Ohio's CEO, Robert Young, who jumped over to run the New York Central. In another 50 years, the C&O, as the core of CSX, would eventually own the New York Central's main line. These scenes are from the late 1950s in Virginia and West Virginia in coal country. Many of the Virginian scenes are along the James River. The James River flows all the way to Richmond, Virginia, and passes by the historic Jamestown English settlement of 1607, named after the English king, James I. Many of the inhabitants in these Appalachian regions use the C&O's gas-electric-powered passenger service. This mode of transportation brought the mail, news, packaged goods, and of course people. This was less costly to operate on the railroad than steam or diesel-powered trains. This C&O Brill gas electric number 9050 is being turned for its return trip. It was capable of towing a few cars that extended its flexibility. The C&O had a total of 6 of this Brill model. What brought the rails here to many of these isolated locations was coal. Coal always seemed to crop up in the most inaccessible parts. The self-reliant inhabitants could outsurvive most any other group in the country, and they were always ready to do the work of working the mines or on the various coal-hauling railroads. Quite a bit more glamorous equipment was found on the C&O's passenger train fleet. C&O lines in yellow connected passengers from Detroit, Louisville, Cincinnati, and connections to Chicago by the way of the New York Central Railroad, since the C&O main line from Indianapolis to nearly Chicago was used for freight only. Eastward to Washington, D.C. brought forwarding connections north to New York City over the Pennsylvania Railroad. After leaving Alexandria, Virginia, the next 8 track miles will cross the Potomac River and bring the train into the large station in Washington, D.C. While the C&O kept high standards for such trains as the George Washington, the road made much of its bottom line profits on hauling coal and even grain to East Coast ports for export. The original purpose of the C&O, to make the ports more valuable, validates the beginning vision to this day. The sunburst paint scheme was applied to some B&O units before the B&O C&O merger. After the merger, the common blue with yellow accents and the B&O's Capitol Dome logo on the nose became the norm. The C&O units had the C&O for Progress logo on the locomotive's noses. C&O Enhancement Blue and B&O Bando Blue were slightly different. The difference was hard to notice after a little fading with time. B&O 9624 and 9622 are TR4 cow and calf sets built by EMD in 1950, originally ordered for the C&O. Each TR4 is a mated pair of SW7s, with one being a cabless B unit. These were fine yard and transfer engines with better visibility to aid in spotting crew members giving hand signals during switching moves. In 1964, the B&O and C&O combined their passenger departments to improve marketing and service to the travelers. You can see from this B&O train that the equipment was pooled between the two roads. This NW2 is toiling away in a yard near Ellesmere Junction in Delaware. It was transferred to the B&O in 1973 from parent C&O. The days of small 1,000 horsepower switchers like this were drawing to a close. The 1970s would see heavier power performing these tasks. B&O GP40s 4007 and 4008 were still new looking in 1976. They were built in 1971. The Chessie and C&O power here on B&O tracks mean that the Chessie era is already 2 years old, and merged power is spreading everywhere on the combined lines. It was sad to see the older GP9s, such as this pair, replaced with more modern power. These two GP9s were soon repainted into Chessie colors, but they were retired for good in the mid-1980s. Next we'll see some Western Maryland scenes and see how they came into the Chessie fold. Passenger service was never a big operation on the Western Maryland. The railway was better known as a coal hauling road and a road that helped link important general freight traffic from Chicago east to Baltimore, Maryland with other partners. The power today on this train is an Alco Model RS3, built in 1953. The station and freight house are gone. This was a junction with a set-out track for this electric interurban line. The Potomac Edison was an electric interurban that ran from Hagerstown to Frederick, with a line here to Thurmont, where connections were made with the Western Maryland. This line is long pulled up, and you can still make out some of the right-of-way from the air, plus Allegheny Power uses some segments for electric transmission lines now. Despite being a coal hauling road, the Western Maryland dieselized early and retired their coal-burning steam engines sooner than many other coal hauling roads. This map shows the principal lines of the Western Maryland Railway. They had a reputation for running fast freight trains with other roads. The link from Chicago was with the speedy Nickel Plate Road and the Pittsburgh and West Virginia on the Western Maryland's western flank at Connellsville. The Reading Line linked their eastern flank to Philadelphia and New York City. Between these roads they had a fast freight service that was competitive with larger roads that could run trains end to end. A helper set of pure vintage Alco diesel power moves past an eastbound at Williamsport, Maryland. We'll see the helpers at work on another eastbound train led by B&O 3722. The B&O had a line parallel to the Western Maryland between Cherry Run and Connellsville. The B&O kept its line and tore out the Western Maryland track. Now it's just a rail trail along the north bank of the Potomac River. Other trackage was nibbled away over the years. As the crow flies, this train came off the B&O main line about 10 miles west of here at Cherry Run by crossing the Potomac River to head east, now on Western Maryland tracks. The Western Maryland had long been owned through stock ownership by the B&O. Although the B&O was a non-voting stock owner to avoid problems with the ICC. The Western Maryland exercised a lot of independence, but it did cooperate with the B&O. That non-voting problem for the B&O ended shortly after 1966 and the ICC reforms that happened after the B&O-C&O merger of 1962. After that, the Western Maryland came under closer control. The last gasp of local Western Maryland control seemed to be the purchase of newer diesels with their red, white, and black circus colors. Some of this Western Maryland power looks a bit anachronistic in the early 1970s, but Western Maryland diesels always had a high standard of maintenance. They extracted a long service life out of their equipment with good equipment availability, and that was rare back in those days. It wasn't long before the Western Maryland diesels were to be found all over the emerging Chessie System. The integration of the Western Maryland and the B&O-C&O combination brought a sameness of Chessie colors with sublettering under the cab windows of ownership on paper of the Western Maryland, B&O, and C&O units. Today, only a few remnants of the Western Maryland are still used. Once Chessie was formed, it was deemed important to reduce duplicate tracks, and with it, the cost of upkeep and the workforce to maintain it. Alongside the Potomac River are remnants of the historic C&O Canal that was essentially put out of favor by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The railroad reached here at the Point of Rocks by 1832. The B&O was built to eventually connect the port of Baltimore, Maryland to the Ohio River. It was a way to help Baltimore's port compete with New York and Philadelphia ports. The B&O was an important part of the country's early development. The eastern half of the U.S. once featured dozens of Class I railroads that have been merged recursively and folded into two very large ones. The railroad industry started back east in the 1830s to 1850s, and then the west was still just room to expand into. So the east became overbuilt with duplicate roads far beyond any sense of necessary competition. The 19th century's overbuilding was in part fueled by the misuse of people's investments. Once the 20th century brought road and highway development, the railroads lost their monopoly in the long-haul freight and passenger business. The earlier 1914 completion of the Panama Canal also took some of the potential coast-to-coast business away from the railroads. In response, the railroads began a long, slow series of combination and abandonments to chip away at duplication. By the 1950s, the remaining roads were fighting over what was already not lost to trucks. The few roads that were still healthy included the C&O and their competitor, the Norfolk and Western. Both had good routes to haul coal to export ports on the East Coast, and both became the cores around which the two present-day super systems are formed. All of these roads and many more outsiders were caught up in the slow 20th century minuet of eastern U.S. railroad mergers. This merger dance went into high gear in the 1960s, and for most rail fans it reached its conclusion by the late 1990s. While many of the vanished colors and identities have disappeared via consolidation, it seems to have been inevitable. Other changes in the rules enacted by government agencies were also changed to give railroads more flexibility and the ability to compete. Many of the old laws were created when railroads only competed with each other. The laws needed revision when a smaller number of railroads were competing less with each other and more with other modes of transportation using subsidized highways and even air terminals. The railroads were always very good at handling bulk commodities, especially coal and ore. Long ago, they lost the less than carload or LCL business to trucking. A way to regain much of that lost business was the promotion of piggyback or trailer on flat car business. Later than these scenes shown here would be the rise of container and stack trains that made transloading from ships to trains and finally to delivery trucks a universal solution that was adapted worldwide. Labor agreements were changed to redefine how much work per employee could be expected and the nature of the work. Changes came to redefine how many miles existed between crew changes, and even how many were in the train's crew. By the early 1980s, the CSX merger between the Chessie System and the Seaboard System was taking hold. The B&O, WM, and C&O marks under the cab windows were gradually replaced with very small CSXT marks, while units awaited a complete repaint. Many of the things in this video went away for good. The cabooses were soon considered to be obsolete. With shrinking road crew sizes, no one was left to ride in them. Line-side hotbox detectors and better axle bearings, plus dragging equipment detectors, made train observing from the caboose less needed. The Chessie merger of C&O and B&O seems simple on the surface. In 1960, the C&O was accumulating B&O stock. We all know where that activity leads. This was in a business climate in railroading that had everyone scrambling to merge, or they would face marginalization or even possible extinction. The C&O and B&O had noticeably different geographies. They crossed each other in a few places, but they didn't compete much other than between Washington to Chicago. The New York Central was looking to merge with the B&O as well. They had been direct competitors in the New York to Chicago and St. Louis game. The board members of the B&O had a preference to merge with the C&O. The New York Central's Al Pearlman was almost desperate to be included in the B&O and C&O merger. After the New York Central was rejected, they ultimately were forced to fall into the infamous 1968 Penn Central merger of the New York Central and the Pincy, and that became a historic disaster. The ICC approved that merger by February 1968. It went bankrupt by June 1970. The ICC eventually approved the B&O-C&O merger by May Day of 1962, creating an 11,000-mile new system. The reason we say eventually is that the B&O fell from a gross income of $395 million to $359 million by 1961, and it was dropping like a rock by the time the merger went through. The actual effective date of the merger was a little later, on February 4, 1963. The merger brought much-needed cash from the wealthy C&O to improve the B&O's somewhat run-down track and worn equipment. Here are the relative sizes of these three roads and their gross revenues at the pre-merger date of around 1960. The dollar figure in millions is on the left and the trackage in miles is on the right. The Western Maryland trackage varied with various mines, opening and closing, and the Western Maryland's trackage rights over B&O segments. A few miles from the B&O's east yard is the South Philly Yard, operated by Conrail. Trackside action brought lots of transfer runs of Chessie's trains here. The interlocking tower named Stadium was rebuilt in concrete block in 1955, but it no longer serves this yard. The B&O had been gaining control of the Western Maryland since the 1920s. To keep the ICC from breaking the plan up, the B&O held only a non-voting status in the shares of Western Maryland stock that it owned. The B&O and Western Maryland from then on worked in cooperation but remained unmerged. The ICC finally allowed the C&O and B&O combination to add the Western Maryland Railway to the merger by 1967. The C&O, B&O plus Western Maryland Group was placed into the Chessie System holding company later in 1973. This was in preparation for bigger things to come. Anyone watching the merger closely would have noticed that it was a very cautious and gradual process, possibly an explanation why it went so smoothly. By 1970, the combined system was nearing $1 billion in gross income. Back then, that was a lot of money. Many less fortunate eastern roads were already bankrupt at that time. The Nickel Plate Road ran in parallel with the New York Central between Buffalo, New York, and Chicago. The 1968 Penn Central merger between the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad stipulated that the New York Central give up control of the Nickel Plate Road to Norfolk and Western. That helped erode some of the Western Maryland's connectivity. At one time, the Norfolk and Western was controlled by the Pennsy. By now, the mighty Pennsy, known as the Standard Railroad of the World, was a financial wreck, and the Norfolk and Western was flying high. All of this was in an era that made it difficult for railroads to plan ahead very far, in fear of a sudden merger pulling the rug out from under them, a merger either involving them or a nearby competitor. The Chessie System name was chosen to simplify the identity of these three merged roads into one new marketable name, and yet indicate that the Chesapeake and Ohio was still the main force behind the merger. 3757 is a GP40. GP30 number 3000 is an XC&O class unit. GP30s in Chessie that came from the C&O were in the 3000 and up number range, whereas XB&O GP30s were numbered 6900 and up. You can see remnants of the old Pennsylvania Railroad electrification days still remaining in the, by now, Conrail yard. The Seaboard Coastline was a railroad from the 1963 combination of the Atlantic Coastline and the Seaboard Airline Railroads. From Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia, they ran intertwined down the eastern coastal region and reached westward into the deep south at Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama. They both served down into Florida, tapping into the sunshine tourist trade by bringing packed trainloads of northerners from their winter burdens. The wealth of agricultural and mineral products went north, and manufactured goods went south until recent years. The New South was soon to become a large manufacturing region on its own right. This is Waldo, Florida, with a southbound SCL train followed by a northbound. The Clinchfield Railroad was another line brought into the merger picture. At 296 miles length, it neatly filled a gap between the L&N in yellow and the Seaboard in purple. The next three scenes show Clinchfield power in various color schemes, leading trains on Seaboard Coastline rails. The Seaboard Coastline Power was in its basic black with yellow accents and aluminum lettering. The 1972 innovation was the gray Family Lines paint we'll see more of later on. The gray number 4708 is a GP16, one of 155 rebuilt from worn-out EMD products such as GP7 and GP9 models. This was a way in the 1970s to save the cost of buying all new power, at least for a while. The N&W, or Norfolk and Western, was a wealthy coal-hauling regional rival to the Chesapeake and Ohio. These two roads announced a merger in 1965. The 1968 bankruptcy of the Penn Central and other roads stopped this merger cold. By 1982, the Norfolk and Western would merge with the Southern Railway to form the Norfolk Southern as a more organized competition for the 1980 Chessie and Seaboard Alliance. We'll look back in time to the 1950s on the original Seaboard Airline Railroad. The term airline dates from predecessors in the 1870s, long before travel was made by aircraft. The term refers to a direct course, or in the vernacular, as the crow flies. The Seaboard Airline was put together from a patchwork of short lines, like so many other roads that grew in size. This rail car, number 2028, was similar to the C&O Brill unit we saw earlier. However, it is a diesel-electric and built by the St. Louis Car Company in 1936, and it was used until 1971, with the dawn of Amtrak. After the 1963 merger, it became number 4900 in the black Seaboard scheme. Number 2028 runs down to a location where we can see the old John P. Grace Bridge that has since been replaced. This is an SCL mail train pulled by a single E unit. This E-unit is in the pre-merger colors. The white is actually a faded mint green color. In photos, it almost always looks like white. An SCL mail train has new train orders handed off to the conductor. We'll next see a number of SCL passenger trains from 1970 behind black E-units, pulling their sparkling stainless steel passenger cars. This is a southbound nearing the Delray Beach station in Florida. 551 is a former Seaboard Airline E7A. Next will be leading number 519, an E6A from the Atlantic coastline. E6s had a more slanted nose. The third locomotive was an RF&P unit. The back of this train has Union Pacific and Pennsy cars. Leading is number 592, a 1950-built E8, built for the Seaboard airline. Many stainless steel passenger cars wound up going to Amtrak when it took over the passenger service in 1971 of nearly all American railroads. The high level of maintenance of SCL equipment was appreciated at the time. The brown and orange colors of the Illinois Central could be seen even here at Delray, Florida, on the jointly owned and operated City of Miami. Alexandria is the north end of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad that ran south to meet the Seaboard at Richmond, Virginia. The RF&P will be featured later on. The SCL merger colors became basic black with yellow accent stripes and aluminum-colored lettering. SCL 586 on the Point is one of many E units that went to Amtrak by 1971. Unlike some other roads, these passenger trains had no problem filling seats and sleeping car berths. The length of this southbound Silver Meteor shows why financial losses on passenger trains wasn't a particular issue on the SCL. It was an issue on most other eastern roads. The Louisville and Nashville was a large and successful southern road that was controlled by the smaller ACL since 1902. This is an L&N passenger train leaving Louisville, Kentucky. The L&N stretched from New Orleans, arcing up through Birmingham, Alabama, to reach namesake Nashville and Louisville. Atlanta and Memphis were important links to other roads. Links to Chicago came from buying a part of the C, E, and I, and additionally, the Monon line from Louisville to Chicago. This is a mono passenger train leaving Louisville to head north. They didn't have the glamour of the L&N trains, but they were clean and the public liked them. Back at Waldo, Florida in 1978, we find a pair of L&N GP38s away from their home tracks. By this time, the diesels from the SCL and L&N were wandering all over their combined systems. Leading is 513, a 1973 GP38. The railroad's communication line poles to the left of the train are features from a lost era of telegraphs and train orders. Today, the railroads use optical fiber and microwave for its connectivity. Our location is at Waldo, Florida on the old SAL main line. The population here is under 1,000 in a scenic wooded area mixed with farmlands. The elevation is around 150 feet. The caboose at the rear of this train is already marked for the family lines with a box showing SCL and L&N markings. In smaller letters, the Georgia, Clinchfield, and West Point lines are also shown. This is the lettering of the Seaboard Coastline caboose before the family line's relettering. The yellow L&N lines are shown here as they connected with the Seaboard Coastline at Atlanta, Georgia, Birmingham, and Montgomery, Alabama, and Chattahoochee, Florida. The family line's colors on diesels began in 1972, since hardly anyone knew that the L&N and others were owned by the SCL. At the same time, the creation of the Chessie markings enhanced their marketing without a full merger on that system. These L&N diesels in family line colors helped market the connectivity of all these lines and dramatize the size and scope of the full system. It was a way of garnering some benefits of a full merger without really merging. These new gray colors with red and yellow accents seem to have an L&N color influence, taking the SCL away from the more somber black color. Callahan, Florida is near Jacksonville. The old Atlantic coastline crossed the Seaboard Airline here. Heading north is a train led by an L&N U-30C. An L&N caboose still in original colors brings up the rear. The Seaboard section of the huge 1980 CSX merger was a bit more complicated than the Chessie System merger. The 1963 Seaboard Coastline merger may have been the merger that triggered many other mergers and created events that rippled through the industry for over 30 years. We'll explain some of these events concerning this merger. The Seaboard Coastline was the result of the merger of the Seaboard Airline and the Atlantic Coastline Railroads that was approved by the ICC in December 1963. The L&N was operated independently but still owned by the Atlantic Coastline. The L&N shows up in the mix when the Seaboard Coastline was rebranded as the Family Lines in 1972. The Seaboard System name came from the formal merger of the Seaboard Coastline and the L&N by December 1982. The gray with red and yellow accents of the Family Lines was incorporated into the new Seaboard System paint scheme. After 1982, the full CSX merger produced trains with a wild variety of power, intermixing all over the Chessie and Seaboard systems. This mixing included cabooses, too. CSX now had a lot of power to repaint into CSX colors. It took a long time to complete, with some older power being retired before the repainting was complete. You'll notice how the small letters CSXT start to appear under the cab windows after the 1980 CSX merger. We'll think back on the merger sequence while we see trains and colors that have long vanished. The first ACL and SAL mergers into the SCL was an odd merger in a way. Both the ACL and the SAL were in fine financial shape at the time of the proposed merger. Before those days, ICC approval needed at least one of the roads to be hopelessly in financial trouble if the two roads had greatly overlapping territory. Then the weak road was paired with a stronger road in the hopes of some form of rescue. While competition was reduced in common areas, it would at least preserve service on other areas that otherwise would wind up with no rail service at all. The Seaboard Coastline had control over the L&N, or Louisville and Nashville. The control was inherited through the Atlantic Coastline's control that dated back to 1902. It came from a 51% stock ownership. The L&N was actually larger than either the Seaboard Airline or the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. Here are the relative sizes and gross revenues at around 1960. The lead unit is an Alco Model C628. It was bought by the Atlantic Coast Line in 1963, 4 years before the Seaboard Coast Line merger was approved. The Alco Company was soon out of business in the U.S. The second unit is a former Atlantic Coast Line GP7 built in 1950. These are GE U-36Bs. They were new in 1970. They were the pinnacle of the U-Series power on 4 axles, bringing 3,600 horsepower each. Of these 4 GEs, the outer units are U-36Bs, and the inner units are U-33Bs from a 1969 order. This 1,200 horsepower switcher, number 193, is from a group of 65 bought by the ACL in the early 1950s. Number 171 is from the same group of EMD-built SW9s. Here at Yemassee, South Carolina, a leading northbound SD45 on the old ACL main line crosses over another ACL track that no longer crosses where this station agent hands up his train orders. A U-36B and a U-18B sandwich a GE road slug, or mate. GE built 30 of these for the SCL by 1972. This is a phosphate train loaded at nearby Bartow, Florida, known as the Bone Valley. This huge phosphate mine is still an important rail customer. When you see well-dusted cars on trains through this area, you can bet they spent some time on the phosphate trains. Phosphates are used in fertilizers, food products, cosmetics, and detergents. Leading and assisting an Amtrak train is an 8-cylinder GE U18B from 1973. Notice the recycled EMD Blomberg trucks used on this U18B. SCL had 105 of these economical lower 1800 horsepower diesels. Since 1902, the L&N operated with an independence of its Atlantic Coastline owner, or ACL. It did well without any outside influence. The L&N extended to New Orleans with its ports and rail connections that extend to the west coast. The L&N was the biggest coal hauler in the Deep South. They bought control of the 1,200 miles of the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway by 1896. It was known as the Dixie Route. The L&N finally merged the Dixie Route in 1957. In 1977, the Seaboard Coastline was deep into negotiations with the Southern Pacific Railroad. This was triggered by fears of the Southern teaming up with the Missouri Pacific. The Seaboard and SP merger would have created the first Atlantic Coast to Pacific Coast system. We still don't have a sea-to-sea railroad in the U.S. The L&N's line into New Orleans would have been a great way to route traffic onto the SP's Sunset route to Southern California. The SP greatly overreached and wanted too much in stock valuation for their half of the new system. Their merger plans ended. The SP was already headed for the decay of their 1980s that would land them in a failed merger with the Santa Fe. Meanwhile, the Seaboard Coastline carried on with a healthy decade. When the Atlantic Coastline and the Seaboard Airline merged, all it did was increase their footprint in the area. Later on, the merger with the L&N increased the road's stride. The Seaboard Coastline brought the L&N into the marketing efforts known by 1972 as the Family Lines. It also included the small Georgia Railroad, the Clinchfield, and the West Point route. This was not an actual merger. It let the shippers on all these lines know that the service with any was the same as with all, and with the same resources. In 1982, Seaboard Coastline and the Louisville and Nashville Railroad merged to form the Seaboard System. This was an internal step to the already planned CSX. The Richmond-Fredericksburg and Potomac, or RF&P, was a 113-mile-long line that connected other railroads between the Potomac River and Washington, D.C., down to Richmond, Virginia, shown here in relationship with the B&O and C&O railroads. This was a double-track, speedy bridge line. The RF&P linked with the ACL and SAL from Richmond, Virginia, north to Alexandria, Virginia, and nearby Washington, D.C., where connections to the Pennsylvania and the Chesapeake and Ohio railroads were made. For service into New York, the Pennsy was used. That later became the Penn Central, and finally, Conrail. The RF&P had a fleet of 20 E8 units for supporting passenger trains. Of the 20, 15 were A units. This scene is in 1972, with 2 E units used on this freight train. This freight is led by an FP7 down the double-track speedway of the RF&P. A northbound trailer train is led by unit number 126, one of 7 GP40s delivered in 1967. The brick building is the RF&P's AF interlocking tower to control traffic through here. Number 103 is a 1950-built GP7 with air reservoir tanks on the roof. This train is heading north to nearby Potomac Yard. That yard has since been removed. This northbound is about 1/2 mile from the Alexandria passenger station. Next is a southbound in front of the station. Both Potomac Yard and Alexandria Yard were eliminated in the merger of the RF&P into CSX in 1991. Here, an Amtrak former Seaboard Coastline E8, equipped with the cab signal box, leads an RF&P E unit and a Seaboard Coastline E unit still in black. The former Seaboard Coastline train became a popular Amtrak train by 1971. Many, but not all, of the Seaboard Coastline passenger E units had cab signals. Amtrak 422 was a former Union Pacific number 945. The Southern Railway ran the Southern Crescent from New Orleans to Washington, D.C., independently of Amtrak until 1979, when the train finally became another Amtrak train. The cars with the black roofs are former Seaboard cars. In the back of this train are some Tropicana juice cars in the former original white paint. These went north from sunny Florida in solid trains and returned south in smaller groups as they were unloaded. The caboose was formerly from the Clinchfield Railroad. In this freight is an old Atlantic Coastline boxcar. The tracks off to the far right went to a small southern railway yard that is now reclaimed land used for shopping and office developments. This is one of the 9 SW1500 EMD switchers that were bought in 1966 and 1967. Back then it was still necessary to reblock many of the trains that came from the Seaboard Coastline, Southern Railway, and from the north, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Although C&O passenger trains ran through here, C&O freight trains did not. Once CSX merged the RF&P into the system, the yard in Alexandria became mostly unnecessary. It became just another link in the overall CSX system. Even so, it's a very nice double-track section of high quality. The RF&P was no longer a bridge line linking the separate lines of the North and the South. Much of the land for the Potomac Yard was converted to property development projects. All RF&P road locomotives had automatic cab signals that required a special box on the lead locomotive. This was a safer way to operate, where the track signal indications were displayed in the engineer's cab. It was impossible to mistakenly run by a red signal in a fog or lack of attention looking out the cab window. Trains forwarded over the RF&P needed either an RF&P owned lead locomotive or a foreign road locomotive with compatible equipment. The last half of the 20th century was replete with mergers that could have been, but came up short. Had these not-to-be mergers been made, each in its own way would have altered the outcome of the rail map in profound ways that are interesting to speculate about now. The Plan C came about from the failure of many eastern roads that needed to be reorganized with some hope of survival. At least the tracks that served the customers would remain. The bankruptcy of the Penn Central had focused everyone's attention on solving the Northeast Railroad's problems. Many feared outright government seizure of the railroads in recognition of their failure to run their affairs as private entities. The government's United States Railway Administration, or USRA, looked to the newly minted Chessie System in 1973 to bail out several bankrupt, smaller roads that would have added several thousand more route miles. This plan was not just taking in duplicate tracks to the Chessie System. This would have brought new industrial markets into play at Scranton, New York City, Harrisburg, New Jersey, and Upper State New York, to mention a few. It would have been a marketing department's dream. The principal route additions would have been 1,600 miles of the bankrupt Erie-Lackawanna. The EL's tracks would have stretched from Akron and Cleveland, Ohio, east to New York City, and the chemical industries in New Jersey. Another inclusion had 420 miles of the Reading Railroad in the offering. That would have nicely bridged the original B&O lines from Philadelphia into New York City. The USRA offering included the equipment and none of the accumulated debt, and no obligation to fund the large commuter rail operations that both roads had been saddled with. By 1976, the deal began encountering snags with the various unions concerning employees of the bankrupt roads. They would not agree to accept the wages and work rules of the Chessie System's workforce. It seemed to the Chessie System that these old wages and work rules were part of the reason for these roads being bankrupt. The unions did not want to set new, lower standards, and Chessie could foresee new higher wages suddenly expanding into their own workforce. So the unusual offer of a pre-approved, expanding merger just came apart at the seams. In April 1976, the Erie-Lackawanna and the Reading were then quietly rolled into the new Conrail system that had been formed out of the Penn Central Railroad and 6 other bankrupt roads. So here we see a former Reading diesel already paint-patched with CR marks, leading a blue Conrail SD35 on the old Reading tracks that became part of Conrail. The Chessie would just move ahead with what they already had. They would slowly consolidate newly defined operating divisions and unify marketing strategies. No drastic steps meant no missteps, such as some of the other roads had made in mergers before. The future held a more significant merger with the Seaboard System to form CSX. As for Conrail, with lots of struggles, they did become a success. Only to be cut in 2 pieces by 1997 and merged into the CSX and Norfolk Southern as the final big change in Eastern railroading. We cover the many phases of the Conrail story in our Conrail Hall of Fame presentation. Starting in the 1970s, the average person believed as truth the myth that railroads had become unnecessary and a quaint relic of a century ago. Looking at some of the railroads in the 1960s and 70s back east, you could understand that conclusion. In many ways, it was a more interesting era, with quaint operating practices, more locomotive variety, cabooses, and graffiti was totally unknown. Numerous line-side structures were scattered around, and the diesels smoked and made more noise. The darker side was that the industry knew that the public and government sentiment was leaning toward nationalizing the U.S. roads. The collapse of the Penn Central merger, that was totally bankrupt by 1970, triggered that prevailing attitude. It took a lot of difficult changes and work from management and labor to dig out of that era and keep the railroads in private hands. The truth is that fuel and dollar costs per ton mile greatly favor shipping over land by rail. The mergers have brought more efficient railroads that have better track and equipment to exploit their natural advantage. The advantage is the steel wheel rolling on steel rail wastes less energy than tires on asphalt or concrete highways. That will still be viable in the 21st century. By 1980, the CSX merger brought Chessie and the Seaboard systems together, a little bit at a time. The 1980s brought more mixing of Chessie and Seaboard system colors, plus predecessor roads of B&O, C&O, Seaboard Coastline, and Family Lines in their older colors.